So it's been over 2 months since I posted a single video on this channel, which is pretty insane for me to say, as generally I've never really taken breaks from YouTube. Now I've still been posting on my other channels, but I won't lie, I do miss talking about shooters, and specifically I really miss talking about Battlefield, which is exactly what we're going to be doing today. I've covered a few games on this channel over the last year or so, but you guys probably know that Battlefield is my one love when it comes to shooters, and so I've decided I'm going to be getting back into weekly Battlefield content here on the channel. Just one video per week for now while things are still pretty quiet on the Battlefield side of things, covering any news we get, speculation, rumors, revisiting the old Battlefield games, some live commentaries, even just ideas for what I want to see in the next game, and pretty much just anything you can think of when it comes to Battlefield content. Today though, over a month after the news actually dropped, that's how slow I've been, we're going to be talking about the announcement from last month from EA and IGN that pretty much revealed the next Battlefield game, quickly covering that as well as giving all of my thoughts and sort of hopes about it. And so without wasting any time, let's get stuck right into it. Now I'm not going to read the blog word for word because, like I said, this news is kind of pretty old at this point. It's over a month old, and I'm sure most of you guys have probably heard that from other creators or just online. I will leave a link to the article below in the description though for anyone who hasn't read it and wants to actually catch up on all of this, but I'm kind of just going to skim through it for now just to get through the more important parts. Now, in the middle of September, IGN interviewed Vince Zampella, who is essentially the head of Battlefield, and he had a lot of great stuff to say, which kind of came out of the blue. I wasn't expecting to hear anything about this game until probably early next year, and so I think it took pretty much everyone by surprise that we got any form of news about the next Battlefield. Now, first and foremost, I'm going to show, I guess, the concept art that they showed in this article. And as you can see, there is a lot going on and it looks very, very cool. It does look very Battlefield-y to me. Now, keep in mind, it is concept art. You can see the actual text down the bottom there that says that. If you zoom in on this image, it is actually very low quality. It's all like sort of low quality renders. All those buildings there at the bottom, for example, they're not very detailed, but that is simply just because it is concept art. But there's been a lot of talk about this potentially being in Gibraltar. That is not confirmed, but that's just something that a lot of people sort of pointed to once this all came out. And there's a lot going on. There's obviously just fire all over the place. There's choppers in the background. There are warships in that little bay over there to the left. It looks like half the city down the bottom is just kind of leveled, and then over on the right there is that like full-on wildfire going on too. So there's a lot going on in this image, and obviously it's hard to gauge any actual true information from a concept art image, but it definitely looks very enticing as a big fan of Battlefield. Now, one of the key paragraphs here says, all of it points to a back to basics approach for the next Battlefield. Indeed, head of Respawn and group GM for EA Studios organization, Vince Zampella, is quick to shout out Battlefield 3 and 4 in the course of sitting down with IGN to talk about these new reveals. On the decision to return to the modern setting, Zampella says, I mean, if you look back at the peak or the pinnacle of Battlefield, it's that Battlefield 3, Battlefield 4 era where everything was modern. And I think we have to get back to the core of what Battlefield is and do that amazingly well, and then we'll see where it goes from there. But I think for me, it's that peak of Battlefieldness in that Battlefield 3 and 4 days. So I think it's nostalgic for players, for me, for the teams even. Those are kind of the heyday, although I would say 1942 also. So that is definitely a very good sign that it does seem like we're going back to that kind of modern setting. I know technically 2042 was also realistically a modern setting, but it feels like this will be before 2042. It seems like it might be set closer to like a 2030, where it's technically still futuristic, but it's not like that far into the future. Now, not too long after he said about the back to basics approach, Vince Zampella did also mention that specialists are also out this time around. He says, so I wasn't there for 2042. I don't know what the rationale was, but for me, it's like the team tried something new. You have to applaud that effort. Not everybody liked it, but you've got to try new things. It didn't work. It didn't fit. Specialists will not be coming back. So classes are kind of at the core of Battlefield, and we're going back to that. So that right there is another very, very good piece of information. That's something that I think every single person wants to hear. And I do agree with him. You've got to kind of applaud them for, I guess, trying something new. Now, it definitely didn't work, and so we can't really applaud them too much because it wasn't a good implementation. But yeah, I think going back to basics and just getting rid of all of those little additions that they made, that is what's going to get Battlefield back to where where it needs to be. And I'm glad that Vince is saying pretty much the same thing. I'm not going to go too deep into the actual blog post after that, but he did also mention that they want to focus on a lot better map design too. Obviously, one of the biggest issues with 2042 was the 128 player count, which although it sounded great on paper, it just didn't really work. And they have essentially confirmed they're going back to 64 players and they want to focus a lot more on crafting some better play spaces rather than just like a big map that kind of looks cool and it looks like it could play well, but then it just doesn't, and you end up running for 5 kilometers before you get into any actual fight. So that's also very, very promising. I think those 3 things that he mentioned, being back to basics, the fact that there's no specialists, and just having some better, I guess, more focused map design, those are probably the 3 biggest things that I was hoping for. And so I'm glad that they have mentioned this straight away in that announcement from last month. Now, before we go any further, getting into my thoughts and stuff like that, if you guys are new to the channel and you're interested in more Battlefield content, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on those notifications. There is plenty more content on the way, so make sure you don't miss out. Now, that is pretty much it for what they covered in this article. It wasn't that long. It was more of just a brief little announcement that they're officially working on the next game and showing a bit of concept art and stuff like that. And so to get into my own thoughts and I guess my own hopes for this as well, I think the number one thing that I really want from this Battlefield game is that they just keep it simple and that they don't try and do too much all at once. I think that's probably the biggest downfall of 2042, is that they kind of tried to change a heap of things all at once. There was the added players with those 128 player lobbies. There was the specialist system, the fact that it even just launched on more platforms than normal, which to be fair isn't their fault. It was just the timing that it came out, that it had to launch on previous gen and next gen and PC and everything. There was even a new engine as well, a new version of Frostbite that they made that game in. It just felt like they tried doing too many things all at the same time. And for me, that's probably the main thing that actually failed. I think if that game had been really good from launch with 64 player lobbies and it just felt very, very Battlefieldy, and then they still implemented the specialist system. I'm not saying the specialist system is better than the class system, because it simply isn't, but I don't think it would have been hated as much if that was the only change that they made. It was just that they did that and then they increased the player count. They had the tornadoes, they had just so many different things going on, and all of that resulted in a bit of a mess that didn't really feel like Battlefield. Now, I did like 2042, but I didn't like it as a Battlefield game. I just thought it was it was an okay shooter. For the most part, I had fun with it, but it definitely did not feel like a Battlefield game, and that's kind of the opposite of what I want for this game. I just want them to go back to the basics like they said in that article and just make this feel like a typical sort of old school Battlefield game that is very simple. It doesn't need to go out of its way to do anything crazy or anything like that, because I think that's where a lot of these issues actually come in. On top of that as well, and this is a kind of promising sign that they're taking longer to make this one than normal, I really want this game to launch well. We haven't had a good Battlefield launch since Battlefield 1, and that was a bit of an outlier too, because the game before that, Battlefield 4, had a terrible launch too. Even though that game is seen as probably the best of the franchise, even that game had a very, very bad launch. So it's been pretty much a decade at this point since we have had a Battlefield game launch in a really good state. And again, Battlefield 1 did, but then it had its own issues with the live service, but that is a bit of an anomaly because usually their live services are really good. So for me, it's very important that they just stick the landing of this game. I hope it launches well. It doesn't need to launch as a 10 out of 10 best Battlefield game ever. If they launch it at a 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10, but it's just stable, it feels good, it's fun to play, and it's not super buggy and stuff like that, that's all I need, because from there we know that DICE are so good at building on their games. You look at Battlefield 5 and it had a very rough launch, yet at the end of that game's lifespan, it was in a really good state. The same thing happened with 2042. The same thing happened with Battlefield 4 as well. We know that they can turn these games around. And so if they actually launch it well and it's good in the first place, then instead of turning it around, they can then just focus that on making it even better. And that's where, like I said, if the game launches at like an 8 out of 10, by the end of its live service, it could be genuinely a 10 out of 10 Battlefield game. So that's something I really hope that they can land. And obviously they're taking an extra year with this one. The game would pretty much be coming out like right now based on their previous timeframes. It's usually a 2 to 3 year turnaround between Battlefield games, but this one is looking like a 4-year turnaround. Granted, we don't know the actual release date yet, but it is promising that they're taking that bit of extra time, so hopefully it can actually launch in a really good situation. The final thing I really want, and this is a pretty small thing, it doesn't actually affect the game at all, but I just want this game to be called Battlefield. I don't want there to be a number. I don't want it to be Battlefield Bad Company 3, even though, to be honest, I would absolutely love if it was Bad Company 3 or just any sort of sub-franchise. But I actually think it would be a great idea for them to almost like soft reboot the franchise and just call this one Battlefield. We can sort of pretend like this is the restart of this franchise that I think it kind of needs at this point. It's had a few bad ones in a row, and it does just feel like it needs to go back to basics and just, yeah, almost a little soft reboot, even the same way I guess that Call of Duty did with Modern Warfare, which, to be fair, the Modern Warfare games, the newer ones, they're not amazing games, so it's not like rebooting just fixes everything, but those games were received really well for the most part, and so it's clear that that can work, and I just think that would be a really good idea for this game. If you call it like Battlefield 6 or whatever it would be, I feel like it kind of carries a little bit of that stigma that Battlefield has at the moment, where it is seen in a bit of a negative light, whereas if they just call it Battlefield, I feel like that's a bit of a statement that like, hey, we are going back to basics. This is kind of the soft reboot of the franchise, and it might give people a bit more reason to kind of go in open-minded about this, even though, like I said, the title doesn't actually affect the game itself. I just think that's something that I would like them to do, and to be honest, I actually do think that's what's going to happen. I'm somewhat confident. I don't actually know why, but I'm just somewhat confident this game is just going to be called Battlefield. I feel like it's weird to call it Battlefield 6. Then again, the numbers and the naming of the Battlefield franchise has never really been all that coherent, so I guess it doesn't need to make sense, really. We went from Battlefield 4 to Battlefield 1 to Battlefield 5 to Battlefield 2042, so it's never really made sense, but I think that's part of what I mean. I think it would be cool to just get rid of all that and just call this one Battlefield, focus on it for honestly like 5+ years, just make this a good long live service. We don't need a new one every 3 to 4 years if the current one is really good, and we've seen a lot of games doing that over the last decade or so. Look at Fortnite, look at Rainbow Six Siege. If the game's good and if people are still playing it, there's no need to release a new one. Just keep supporting that one, make sure it's monetized well but fairly, and people will continue to support it. So that's kind of my hope for it, but I'm keen to hear all of your thoughts on that down in the comments section, so be sure to let me know your thoughts about what they should call it and whether they should support it for a long time or whether you just want like a quick 2 to 3 year turnaround like we normally get. But that is going to do it for today's video, guys. Like I said, I will be doing weekly Battlefield videos here on the channel. I'm just going to be doing one video per week, just kind of slowly ticking things over, getting back into the groove of Battlefield. And then obviously once the game itself starts to ramp up, if we start getting news early next year and stuff like that, I'll definitely start doing more content per week. And realistically, once the game is like on its way, I'll be doing the typical 3 to 4 videos a week. But for now, I'm just going to be sticking to that one video a week, kind of going over a bunch of different stuff, visiting old games and speculating on the new one and all that kind of thing. And hey, if you've got anything you want me to cover or talk about, be sure to let me know down in the comment section as well. But with that being said, thank you all very much for watching. You guys have a great day, and I'll see you all out there on the battlefield.